The clink of crystal glasses echoed through the dining room of Le Riviere, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Boston. The chandeliers above shimmered with a golden glow, casting an opulent light on the long mahogany table lined with white linen and gleaming silver. Every plate bore a meticulous arrangement of salmon, asparagus, and saffron rice, the kind of dish you photographed before you dared touch. Conversation hummed in restrained tones, punctuated by polite laughter. It was the kind of evening meant to impress, where status was measured in the wines ordered and the stories told. At the head of the table sat my brother Nathan, smiling stiffly, his shoulders squared, as if trying to hold himself upright under the weight of appearances. To his right sat his wife, Clarissa Whitmore Reyes, draped in a silk gown the color of champagne. Her blonde hair swept into a chignon so tight it pulled her cheekbones higher. Clarissa carried herself with the kind of confidence that only money passed down through generations could provide. She was the type of woman who spoke in declarations rather than suggestions, who believed silence was agreement and wealth was virtue. I had endured her cutting remarks before the sly digs about my shoes not being designer, the raised brow when I mentioned working late, the soft laugh whenever the topic of property ownership came up. Tonight, though, she was not content with whispers. She wanted spectacle. She raised her glass, the liquid inside swirling like liquid gold, and with a smile that was more of a sneer, she spoke loudly enough for the table to fall into silence. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You are nothing but useless," she said, her gaze locked on me. "People like you will always be renters, never owners." The words hung suspended in the air, heavy, humiliating. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A few eyes darted toward Nathan, who stared down at his plate as if the silver patterns of the cutlery could shield him. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother forced a weak smile, and the others simply pretended to be absorbed in their wine. In that moment, I felt every eye in the room on me, weighing me, measuring me against Clarissa's words. The humiliation surged like a tide. I felt my chest tighten, my palms sweat against the linen napkin I had been clutching. Yet beneath the sting of her insult, beneath the rising heat in my face, another feeling began to stir. It was not rage, not yet. It was something quieter, something sharper. Resolve. I laid the napkin neatly beside my plate, pressing my fingers against the tablecloth to steady the tremor in them. I inhaled deeply, the scent of saffron and charred asparagus filling my lungs, and slowly pushed back my chair. Every sound in the room seemed to dull as I rose to my feet. Clarissa's smile widened, satisfied, certain that she had cemented her dominance. Nathan shifted as if to speak, but thought better of it. The others continued their silence, each one complicit in their cowardice. I did not respond to Clarissa. I did not lower myself to her level with a shouted retort or a desperate defense. I simply stood, shoulders squared, chin lifted. My eyes swept the room from my parents' discomfort to the polished chandeliers that reflected the wealth Clarissa worshipped. And then, without another word, I thought to myself, tonight everything changes. CTA. Have you ever been insulted like this? Comment below where you are watching from. I was born into a world where survival was the only inheritance passed down to me. My parents had come to the United States with nothing more than a few suitcases and a promise of better days, and though they worked tirelessly, there was never enough. My mother died young, leaving behind a silence that even the sound of my father's endless shifts could not fill. I grew up in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a refrigerator that rattled louder than it cooled, learning quickly that life would never hand me anything freely. While other kids my age were discovering hobbies or sports, I was discovering the weight of responsibility. I balanced school with late-night jobs, scrubbing tables in diners, stacking shelves in supermarkets, babysitting until the early hours. There were weeks when I barely slept, moving from one obligation to the next, with only caffeine and sheer determination pushing me forward. That determination carried me into college not through family savings or generational wealth, but through scholarships, loans, and a stubborn refusal to quit. I sat in classrooms beside students who drove new cars to campus while I took the bus in secondhand clothes, but I refused to shrink. Each essay I wrote, every exam I passed, was a reminder that I was not defined by the smallness of my beginnings. My path toward design began almost by accident. I had taken a part-time job cleaning offices to pay for textbooks when I stumbled into an architecture firm. I watched the designers sketch lines that turned into plans that became homes, and something in me caught fire. I enrolled in extra courses, borrowed books, begged professors for advice. When I finally graduated, it was with a degree I had carved out for myself, paid for by nights that blurred into dawns. That was when I created Reyes Design and Holdings, though, at the time, it was little more than a rented desk and a cheap laptop. I started with interior design for small apartments, transforming spaces not with extravagant budgets, but with ingenuity. Clients came to trust me not because I promised them the impossible, but because I delivered more than they expected with what little they had. Word spread, opportunities grew, and I reinvested every cent back into the company. Within a few years, I was no longer just designing rooms. I was buying the buildings themselves, rundown properties that others dismissed. I restored them not just for profit, but with the memory of my childhood in mind. I knew what it meant to live in places that felt like cages, and I was determined to create homes that gave people dignity. Clarissa never understood that. To her, wealth was not about creating, but about displaying, about waving designer handbags and inherited pearls as proof of superiority. Her family's old money gave her a pedestal from which she judged everyone, including me. From the moment Nathan introduced us, her eyes had cataloged my flaws: the dress I wore that was purchased on sale, the shoes that were practical rather than fashionable, the modest car I drove. She laughed at the fact that I still rented my office space instead of owning a marble tower. She dismissed my company as a hobby, a way to keep me busy until I married well. She did not know, and perhaps she never cared to know, that Reyes Design and Holdings was growing into one of the most influential property firms in Boston. Nathan had once been different, or at least I believed he had. When we were children, he was the protective brother who shielded me from bullies and shared his half of dinner when I was still hungry. But wealth has a way of twisting loyalties. After marrying Clarissa, his gaze began to mirror hers, and the pride he once felt in my accomplishments dulled beneath her sneers. He began to distance himself, attending family events where I was merely tolerated rather than embraced. Slowly, it became clear that he no longer saw me as his equal, but as a shadow that embarrassed him. I had become invisible in the very family I had once fought to hold together. Yet invisibility has its uses. While they dismissed me, I grew stronger in silence. While Clarissa flaunted, I built. While Nathan turned away, I turned inward, anchoring myself in the belief that dignity was not something anyone could grant me. It was something I had already earned. And as Clarissa's insults grew louder, so too did my quiet power, waiting for the moment to surface. The dining room that evening was a theater, and Clarissa was determined to play the leading role. Every gesture she made was exaggerated, every laugh just a little too loud, every word sharpened to ensure that her audience noticed her dominance. The guests gathered were a blend of extended family and her circle of wealthy friends, each one sipping vintage wine as though it was their birthright. Conversation flowed easily about investments, new developments in Beacon Hill, the latest ski trips to Aspen. It was all carefully curated to highlight privilege. I sat quietly, content to observe, until Clarissa decided that silence was not enough. She turned the spotlight directly onto me. She tilted her head, smiled with saccharine sweetness, and said, "Some of us buy. Some of us just rent forever." A ripple of awkward laughter passed through the table, the kind of laughter that is less amusement and more compliance. People laughed not because it was funny, but because it was easier than confronting her cruelty. I felt the familiar sting of heat rise in my chest, but I kept my face calm, my eyes steady. Clarissa leaned closer to her glass, pretending to admire the vintage before adding, "Isn't that right, Isabella? You know all about rentals, don't you? Always temporary, never permanent." The humiliation was deliberate, a blade honed to slice through the thin fabric of civility. Forks paused mid-air, wine glasses hovered untouched. Even the background music seemed to hush as the focus narrowed to me. My brother Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked as though he wanted to intervene. His lips parted, but then his gaze flicked toward Clarissa, and whatever courage he might have summoned dissolved into silence. My parents were no better. My father cleared his throat as though the sound might distract from the cruelty. My mother gave a smile so brittle it could have shattered at the slightest touch. No one spoke for me. No one rose to stop her. I was alone in the glare of her contempt. Clarissa's friends leaned in hungry for drama, savoring the spectacle of the outsider being reminded of her place. I felt my pulse in my temples, each beat a reminder of how deeply her words cut not just for what they implied about my worth, but for how quickly everyone else allowed her insult to stand. I wanted to defend myself, to shout that my company had grown, that I was building something real, that I had fought for everything I had, while she had simply inherited her pedestal. But I knew that if I raised my voice here in this room, I would only be giving her exactly what she wanted, a display of desperation. She wanted me flustered, defensive, undone. I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I sat straighter, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably long. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, each one waiting to see if I would break. Clarissa mistook my composure for weakness. She smirked, taking a slow sip of wine, as though to punctuate her victory. "It is not your fault, really," she added almost sympathetically, her tone laced with venom. "Some people are simply not meant to rise. It is better you accept that, rather than chase illusions of grandeur." That final blow landed like a stone in my stomach, and for a fleeting moment I felt small again, the girl who used to patch up her only pair of shoes with glue, who skipped meals so her brother could eat. Yet just as quickly, another thought surged forward. I was not that girl anymore. I had built myself piece by piece, brick by brick. The shame she tried to pour over me began to burn into something else, resolve cold and steady. I placed my napkin gently on the table as though I had simply finished eating and rose to my feet. The legs of my chair scraped softly against the polished floor. The sound was enough to draw every eye. Clarissa's smirk widened, certain she had forced me to retreat. In her mind, I was leaving, defeated, fleeing the table because I could not withstand her. But what she saw as retreat was simply me, choosing a battleground of my own making. I did not need this table, these chandeliers, this audience of cowards who applauded cruelty with their silence. I had my own power hidden in plain sight, and soon enough she would learn what it meant to underestimate me. Without a word, I walked from the dining room, head held high. Behind me, the murmurs began to rise, half-hearted attempts to smooth the rupture she had caused. Clarissa lifted her glass in triumph, convinced she had silenced me. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that she had not silenced me at all. She had only lit the fuse. The night air outside La Riviere was sharp slicing against my skin as I stepped out onto the cobblestone street. Boston in winter had a way of reminding you just how small you were. The icy wind pushing against you, like a force, daring you to keep moving. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward the curb where taxis idled under the yellow glow of street lamps. Behind me, the muffled laughter of the dinner party carried faintly through the heavy doors, a reminder of the cage I had just walked out of. I did not look back. My heels clicked against the pavement as I approached the first cab. The driver glanced up, recognition flickering briefly in his tired eyes, but he said nothing as I slid inside. The warmth of the car cocooned me from the cold, and for the first time that evening I allowed myself to breathe. My hands trembled against my lap, not from fear, but from the fury I had kept contained. Clarissa believed she had humiliated me, believed that her words were the final nail in the coffin of my dignity. But humiliation is only final if you accept it. I stared out the window as the city blurred past the streets lined with brownstones and high-rises glowing with the lives of others. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one Clarissa still believed I was powerless, voiceless, destined to scrape by. But I was not that girl anymore. I was the woman who had built an empire in silence, who had turned every insult into mortar, every slight into steel. The cab turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, and I felt the calm settle over me. The decision had already formed. Tonight was not about anger. Tonight was about precision. By the time the driver pulled up to my building, a restored townhouse whose lease agreements passed quietly through my hands each month, the trembling in my fingers had stopped. I paid him, stepped into the crisp night, and climbed the steps to my door. The warmth of my apartment wrapped around me, elegant but understated every detail, a reflection of what I had built for myself. I crossed the living room heels, sinking into the Persian rug I had chosen after months of saving, and picked up the phone from the marble console. My finger hovered only a moment before dialing. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered alert, despite the late hour. Isabella, is everything all right? Elena Moore, my lawyer and closest confidant, had always known when something was wrong. Terminate the Whitmore's lease? I said, my voice steady calm. Effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end, the clatter of keys as though she were already preparing the paperwork. Then her voice softened cautious. This will cause a storm. I stared out the window at the city lights, countless windows glowing against the night sky like reminders of everything I had once dreamed of. My reflection stared back at me in the glass eyes, clear mouth set. Good, I said quietly, each word deliberate. Let them drown. Elena exhaled the kind of sound that carried both resignation and admiration. Consider it done. When the line clicked off, I set the phone back onto the console, my pulse steady now. The silence of the room seemed to hum with anticipation, as if even the walls knew that a line had been crossed, that nothing would ever return to what it had been. Clarissa thought the dinner had ended with my defeat. She had no idea it had ended with the beginning of her downfall. The following morning, the city was wrapped in a pale winter fog, but inside my apartment the air was clear sharp with the scent of black coffee steaming on the table beside me. I sat before the wide windows of my study, staring at the skyline of Boston, every building a reminder of the empire I had been quietly assembling piece by piece. The world knew me as Isabella Reyes, interior designer consultant, the woman who transformed living spaces with vision and taste. Few knew the fuller truth. Beyond the surface, I was the architect of a growing network of holdings, a landlord to more than I ever dared say aloud. I had spent years mastering the art of invisibility. In an industry dominated by old names and inherited fortunes, anonymity was my shield. I placed layers of companies between myself and the properties signed contracts through intermediaries and let Elena handle the face-to-face negotiations. It was safer that way. To those like Clarissa, I remained the outsider, the renter, the perpetual guest, and I had let them believe it, because nothing is more dangerous than a woman underestimated. The Whitmores lived in a penthouse in Back Bay, an address Clarissa never failed to flaunt. She boasted of its views over the Charles River, its Italian marble floors, its custom chandeliers. What she never knew, what she could not imagine, was that the papers tied to her lease bore my name hidden beneath the layers of corporate signatures. She was a queen, yes, but one living under my roof. I had kept that secret not out of fear, but out of choice, waiting for the moment when truth would cut deeper than any insult she could hurl across a dinner table. As I sipped my coffee, I allowed myself to drift back through the years to the origin of this quiet power. I remembered the first time I bought a property, a crumbling 3-story building on the edge of Dorchester. The walls sagged, the pipes leaked, and the neighbors laughed at the thought that anyone would waste money on it. But I had seen possibility in its bones. I worked day and night, pouring every ounce of my earnings into renovation sketching designs on scraps of paper, negotiating with contractors who doubted me until they saw the precision in my plans. When the project was complete, the building no longer resembled the ruin I had purchased. It was fresh, vibrant a home where tenants walked in with pride instead of shame. Their rent checks, small but steady, became the seed for the next building and the next. Slowly, block by block, I carved my name into the map of Boston, though few knew it. Along the way, I learned that anonymity was power. When developers dismissed me, I let them. When wealthy heirs overlooked me, I smiled and nodded. Meanwhile, I signed deeds, purchased land, and waited. Patience was my greatest ally. Clarissa's words from the night before echoed in my mind like smoke, but they no longer stung. Useless. Renters forever. She had no idea that she was speaking those words while her name rested on a lease contract issued by me. The irony would have been laughable if it had not been so perfectly poetic. I thought of Nathan, too, my brother, who had once shared half his plate with me when I was still hungry. He had forgotten those nights. Clarissa had helped him forget. To her, I was nothing but the shadow that reminded him of a time he wanted to erase. Perhaps that was why he had sat in silence at dinner, unable to defend me. He was not only afraid of his wife, he was ashamed of himself. I set down the coffee and pulled a thick binder from the shelf. Inside were the records meticulously kept of every property, every holding. Elena had taught me the importance of precision of documentation, and here it was, page after page of signatures that proved the truth. At the very center, the crown jewel, the Back Bay penthouse, the Whitmore's penthouse. I traced the edge of the paper with my fingertips steady, deliberate. I could end their illusion with a single motion with one clause in their lease contract. Termination without renewal. The power was mine, and it had always been mine. Clarissa thought her words had wounded me. In reality, she had offered me the perfect stage. For years, I had hidden in silence, content to let my victories remain unseen. But sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness. Sometimes respect must be demanded, not requested. I remembered another dinner long ago when I was 22 and still in college. I had been invited to the home of a man I was dating, a boy from a family of wealth. His mother had smiled thinly across the table and said, "Girls like you don't marry into families like ours. You're a temporary amusement, nothing more." That night I had cried myself to sleep ashamed, believing her words were prophecy. But the shame had burned into ambition. I promised myself that one day no woman would ever have the power to say those words to me again. That vow had carried me through exhaustion, through doubt, through endless nights where I balanced books and bills with nothing but grit to sustain me. Now, as I looked down at the Whitmore's lease, I knew that vow was being fulfilled. This was not merely eviction. This was reclamation. It was the unveiling of a truth I had carried silently, the revelation of the empire I had built beneath their sneers. Clarissa thought she had humiliated me in front of her circle. She had no idea she was dining in a house of glass while I held the stone. I closed the binder and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the fog was lifting sunlight breaking across the city skyline. A new day was beginning, and with it a reckoning. Soon Clarissa would learn the lesson I had carved into every brick, every renovated wall, every contract signed. Power is not inherited. Power is built. And she was about to learn in the most personal way possible that the woman she called useless was the one who held her keys. The binder remained on my desk long after the coffee had cooled, a silent testament to years of struggle and years of triumph. As I stared at the neat columns of numbers and names, memories surfaced, sharp and relentless, reminding me of why I had fought so hard to reach this point. My earliest memories were not of toys or birthday parties, but of the smell of bleach on my hands after scrubbing tables in a diner long past midnight. I was 14 when I first started working, the weight of our rent hanging over me like a constant shadow. My father was already drowning in double shifts, and after my mother passed away, there was no choice but to step in. I still remember the aching in my legs as I dragged myself home at dawn schoolbooks, waiting sleep, a luxury I could not afford. Those nights hardened me. They taught me that comfort was never guaranteed, that survival came only from relentless persistence. At times, the humiliation of poverty cut deeper than hunger. I recall classmates whispering about my thrift store shoes, the pitying looks when I pulled free lunch tickets from my backpack, the sting of overhearing one teacher murmur that I was unlikely to make it out. Every judgment became a seed, every insult a stone that I carried until I learned to build with them instead of being buried under their weight. By the time I entered college, I had learned how to endure, but endurance alone was not enough. I needed purpose. That purpose arrived unexpectedly when a professor introduced me to a client in desperate need of affordable yet beautiful design. They owned a tiny apartment, bare and lifeless, and asked if I could make it feel like home with almost no budget. I poured myself into that project, sketching late into the night, scavenging materials others had thrown away, using creativity to replace what money could not buy. When I finished, the client cried, saying they finally felt proud to invite people inside. That moment sparked something fierce in me. I realized that design was not about extravagance. It was about dignity. It was about giving people, even those like me who had grown up with nothing, a space where they could breathe, where they could belong. From there, my path unfolded, each step marked by sacrifice. I worked through every holiday, invested every dollar I earned back into my fledgling business, and lived frugally in apartments so small I could stretch my arms and touch both walls. There were days I questioned everything. Days when bills piled higher than contracts, when my body ached from exhaustion, when failure seemed inevitable. Yet in those moments, I thought of my mother's voice telling me even on her sickbed that I was stronger than the world believed. I thought of every insult, every dismissal, every person who had told me that girls like me did not belong at certain tables. Those words became fuel. When I bought my first building, that crumbling wreck in Dorchester, I did it not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself, to prove that I could transform despair into opportunity. The process nearly broke me. Pipes burst, contractors walked out. Neighbors doubted, but I refused to surrender. When it was finished and tenants moved in smiling as they unpacked boxes into freshly painted rooms, I knew I had touched something profound. Success for me was not measured in profit margins, but in the faces of those who finally felt at home. Still, even as my empire grew, I never forgot how precarious life could be. I carried the memory of nights when eviction notices threatened our door, of my father's hands cracked from endless labor of being told that I was less because I had less. That was why Clarissa's words had struck so deeply at dinner. They were not new words. They were echoes of every judgment I had endured since childhood. But unlike then, I was no longer powerless. I had built something indestructible, and her contempt would not diminish it. Instead, it would magnify it. For Clarissa represented everything I despised: entitlement without empathy, arrogance without merit, wealth without responsibility. She flaunted her inheritance as though it were achievement mistaking privilege for character. And Nathan, my brother, had allowed himself to be swept into her orbit, forgetting the nights when we huddled together against the cold, sharing what little we had. His silence at dinner hurt almost as much as her words. But perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps I needed to see the depth of their betrayal to understand the clarity of my mission. I was not fighting only for myself. I was fighting for every child who had been told they were useless, every woman dismissed because she lacked a pedigree, every dreamer who had been mocked for daring to want more. My empire was not an accident. It was the culmination of years of refusing to believe the world's verdict on me. Clarissa thought she had reduced me to nothing with her insult. In truth, she had handed me the stage upon which I would reveal everything. Soon, the world would know what I had built. Soon, she would understand that the woman she called useless had become the architect of her downfall. The notice of termination went out on a Wednesday morning, delivered by courier directly to the gleaming glass doors of the Whitmore's penthouse. Clarissa was still lounging in silk when she opened it. Her nails painted a venomous shade of red that matched the flush that crept into her cheeks as she read the bold words across the top: lease termination effective immediately. Nathan told me later that she screamed, her voice echoing through the marble halls, shattering the illusion of perfection she fought so hard to maintain. Within hours, my phone buzzed with Elena's update. They are demanding a meeting. Do you want to refuse? I let the question hang in the air before answering. No. Let them come. By Friday afternoon, the couple walked into the lobby of my management office, Clarissa's heels striking the floor like gunshots, Nathan trailing behind her with a face carved from worry. She demanded to see the owner, her voice dripping with arrogance, certain she could bully some faceless landlord into reversing the decision. What she found instead was me. I stepped from my office into the waiting area, my presence unexpected, shocking. Clarissa froze, her lips parting as the realization struck. You, she spat as if the word itself was poison. I inclined my head slightly, calm, deliberate. Yes, me. The roof over your head was mine all along. The silence that followed was exquisite. For the first time, Clarissa had no clever retort ready. Her eyes darted to Nathan, but he was as stunned as she was. She recovered quickly, her pride refusing to yield. You cannot do this. We have rights. I motioned for them to follow me into the conference room where Elena was waiting with the paperwork neatly stacked. The room was minimalist, designed for business rather than comfort, the kind of space that stripped away pretense. Clarissa slammed her purse onto the table and leaned forward, her tone sharpened with fury. This is ridiculous! You cannot just throw us out! Elena slid the documents across the table. Her expression, neutral, professional. Per the terms of your lease, the landlord reserves the right not to renew at the conclusion of the term. Notice has been provided in accordance with Massachusetts law. Clarissa snatched the paper, scanning it as though she could force it to say something different. This is abuse. This is revenge. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Contracts speak louder than insults. Consider this eviction the price of your disrespect. Nathan finally spoke, his voice low, strained. Isabella, please. This is not necessary. We are family. I turned my gaze to him, feeling the weight of his betrayal all over again. Family. Family does not sit in silence while their wives humiliate their sisters. Family does not watch someone be diminished and do nothing. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Clarissa, however, refused to be cowed. You think this makes you powerful? You are still nothing. Money does not buy you class. You will never be one of us. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady, each word cutting with precision. I do not want to be one of you. I want to be better. And unlike you, I did not inherit my life. I built it. The tension in the room was electric. Clarissa's face reddened. Her hands clenched so tightly around the contract that the paper crumpled. Nathan tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. Isabella, please reconsider. We have nowhere else to go. I almost laughed at the irony. The woman who had mocked me for being a renter was now begging for a place to live. You will find somewhere, I said coldly. But it will not be under my roof. Clarissa rose suddenly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her eyes blazing. This is not over. You will regret this. I stood as well, not raising my voice, but letting the calmness carry its own authority. No, Clarissa. This is over. And the only one who will regret anything is you. The meeting ended with them storming out, their fury trailing behind them like a storm cloud. Elena turned to me, her brows raised. That was brutal. I exhaled, steady, composed. It was necessary. That night, I replayed the confrontation in my mind, every word, every silence. It was not joy that filled me, but clarity. I had not sought vengeance for its own sake. I had sought justice, balance restored where cruelty had gone unchecked for too long. Clarissa believed she still held the power of her social circle, that her influence could shield her. She had no idea that soon the world beyond our family would know the truth. She had given me the insult. I had given her the consequence. The stage was set for the next act, and it would not take place in quiet conference rooms, but in the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the family, whispered from phone call to phone call, twisted and reshaped depending on who told it. By Sunday afternoon, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced, their faces lined with worry, and something else I had not seen in a long time. Shame. My father stood awkwardly in the doorway, his cap in his hands, while my mother's eyes were heavy with guilt. Isabella, she said softly, we should have defended you. We should never have let her speak to you that way. For years, they had stayed silent, afraid of rocking the fragile peace that came from Nathan's marriage into wealth. But now, faced with the truth of what I had built, their silence weighed on them. I let them in served tea, and for the first time in my life, I heard my father apologize. He admitted that he had always believed money and connections were shields his children needed, that Nathan had chosen the path of safety while I had chosen the path of risk. I was wrong, he said, quietly staring into his cup. You were the stronger one all along. His words softened something in me, though. The wound of their past silence still ached. Clarissa's downfall had already begun to shift loyalties. Nathan, however, was caught in the crossfire of his choices. He called me late one night, his voice breaking through the static of the line. I do not know what to do, he confessed. She is furious. She says I failed her. But when I look at you, I know I failed you more. I listened, my silence pressing him harder than words could. He begged me to reconsider, to allow them to stay, but I reminded him of the night at Le Riviere, the humiliation he had allowed to unfold in front of our entire family. Blood does not excuse betrayal. I said, my voice sharp but calm. You had a chance to stand beside me. You chose her silence instead. On the other end, I heard him inhale shakily. I do not even recognize myself anymore, he admitted. I told him recognition begins with action, not words, then ended the call. Clarissa, meanwhile, unraveled quickly. Without the penthouse, her grip on her social circle loosened. Her friends, who once gathered eagerly for champagne brunches, began to drift away, unwilling to stand by someone whose power was slipping. She lashed out in fury, spreading lies about me, insisting I had schemed from the beginning to destroy her. But the more she raged, the more unhinged she appeared. Invitations dried up, whispers of her arrogance grew louder, and the isolation she had once inflicted on me circled back to consume her. Watching it unfold, I felt no triumph, only inevitability. For people like Clarissa, power built on cruelty is always temporary. My parents began to visit more often, sometimes bringing meals, sometimes simply sitting with me in quiet acknowledgement of the strength they had overlooked. It was not reconciliation in full, but it was a start. In their presence, I sensed their realization that legacy is not carried by those who inherit, but by those who build. As for me, I felt the ground beneath my feet growing steadier. Clarissa's insults had been intended to reduce me, but in the end, they had elevated me not just in power, but in the eyes of my own blood. For the first time in years, I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the one they turned to, the one they respected. And that, perhaps, was the deepest victory of all. The scandal began quietly, a whisper in the business section of the Boston Globe, but within 24 hours it had erupted into headlines splashed across every platform. Designer secretly owns half the luxury rentals in Back Bay. The article detailed my rise from obscurity, tracing my journey from poverty to property mogul, highlighting how I had built Reyes Design and Holdings through grit and vision. What captured attention most, however, was the revelation that one of my tenants had been none other than Clarissa Whitmore Reyes, the socialite who had once boasted of her superiority. Within hours, local TV stations requested interviews, and by evening, my face was on screens across Boston. I sat before cameras poised and calm, recounting my story not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that dignity could be built from nothing. Respect isn't inherited, I told the reporter, my voice steady. It's earned. And sometimes the people you dismiss as useless are the very people holding the keys to your future. That line circulated online, quoted across social media, turned into memes and motivational posts. Support flooded in, not just from women in Boston, but from across the country. Messages poured into my inbox from people who had once been underestimated, thanking me for reminding them that their worth was not defined by the disdain of others. Meanwhile, Clarissa's unraveling became a spectacle of its own. Someone at the dinner had recorded her insult, the words "useless" and "renters forever sharp and cruel" against the backdrop of clinking glasses. That video leaked onto social media paired with the headline about her eviction. It went viral within hours. The contrast was devastating. A woman mocking another for being a renter, revealed to be living under the very roof owned by the target of her ridicule. The internet branded her with hashtags, "How useless Clarissa, Sa renters forever." Clips of her laughter were replayed with captions that turned her words back on her. She became not the queen of Boston society, but its punchline. Her friends distanced themselves quickly. The brunches she once held at the penthouse evaporated, her invitations ignored. Charities she had chaired quietly replaced her name with others unwilling to be associated with scandal. Even Nathan, usually passive, began to pull away, overwhelmed by the chaos she created in every room she entered. The more she tried to defend herself, the worse it became. She claimed I had manipulated the situation, that I had orchestrated everything to destroy her, but no one wanted excuses. The public had already chosen the narrative. The underdog had triumphed, and the arrogant socialite had fallen. National outlets picked up the story. Forbes ran a feature calling me a self-made disruptor in Boston real estate. Women's magazines framed me as a symbol of empowerment. Even late-night hosts joked about the irony, one quipping, "Imagine mocking your landlord at dinner and then finding out she owns your lease. That's not karma, that's foreclosure with flair." I should have felt glee, but what I felt instead was clarity. This was not simply about me and Clarissa anymore. This was about a larger truth, about shining a light on the cruelty of entitlement. At the same time, I used the spotlight to talk about my projects, about the importance of affordable housing, about giving families the dignity of a home. I knew that if I only made it about revenge, the story would fade. But if I connected it to something greater, it would endure. The calls continued. CNN, NBC, even morning shows wanted to hear the story of the woman once mocked as useless who now held an empire. I accepted selectively choosing the platforms that allowed me to highlight the mission behind my work. Each time I told my truth that poverty had taught me resilience, that insults had forged me stronger, that power comes not from wealth inherited, but from courage chosen. Clarissa, meanwhile, could not escape the glare. Paparazzi caught her leaving boutiques with a scowl, captured her shouting at Nathan in parking lots, documented every stumble of her fall. The society pages that once celebrated her now feasted on her humiliation. The same photographers she had courted now turned her into a spectacle. Her rage only made things worse. She lashed out online, attacking me publicly, but each post drew more ridicule, more memes, more mockery. The very friends who once echoed her laughter at dinner now reposted articles praising me. She was alone in the storm she had created. Nathan reached out again, his voice weary. "She is not the same," he said. "She screams every day. She blames me. She blames you. She blames the world." I listened, but offered no comfort. "She is exactly the same," I replied. "The only difference is now the world sees her clearly." As the weeks passed, the scandal did not fade. Instead, it deepened, solidified. My story became a symbol, and Clarissa became a warning. For every woman told she was useless, for every immigrant dismissed, for every dreamer mocked, the tale of the Whitmore eviction spread like wildfire. And through it all, I remained composed, steady, never stooping to pettiness. I did not need to shout. The truth was louder than any insult could ever be. 6 months later, Boston looked different to me. The streets were the same, the skyline unchanged, but the way people looked at me had shifted entirely. Where once I walked invisible, now strangers stopped to shake my hand, to thank me, to tell me they saw themselves in my fight. The scandal that had begun with a cruel word at a dinner table had transformed into a symbol of resilience and justice. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen in society circles. The brunches, the charity galas, the gallery openings, her name had vanished from all of them. When it did appear, it was in whispers, reminders of arrogance brought low. Nathan had finally left her unable to weather the storm she brought into every room. They lived separately now, him in a modest apartment across the river, her drifting between temporary rentals, stripped of the pedestal she once believed unshakable. My parents, once silent witnesses to my humiliation, now stood beside me proudly. They attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony when I unveiled the newest project of Rhea's design and Holdings, a renovated high-rise with 20% of its units reserved for families of limited income. The cameras flashed as I spoke, but my words were not about revenge. They were about dignity. Home. I said to the crowd gathered, "Is not a privilege. It is a right. I know what it is to fear eviction, to feel small, to be told you are useless. That is why I build not just for profit, but for people." The applause was thunderous, not because of my title or my wealth, but because my story belonged to so many others. After the ceremony, a reporter asked if I thought Clarissa would ever return to society. I gave a small smile. "That is not my concern," I replied. "My concern is building futures, not repairing facades." Later that week, Forbes placed me on the cover with the headline, "From Useless to Unstoppable." The photograph showed me standing against the Boston skyline, strong, unflinching. It was not the image of a victim, but of a victor. Clarissa could never erase that. Her attempt to belittle me had become the foundation of my greatest rise. In private moments, I reflected on everything. On the girl I once was patching shoes with glue. On the student who worked until dawn just to afford textbooks. On the woman mocked at a dinner table. I had carried all of them inside me, each one a step toward the empire I now held. Their struggles were not wasted. They had built the woman I had become. Sometimes at night, I thought of Nathan, of the bond we once shared, and how fragile it had proven to be. His betrayal had cut deep, but perhaps his silence had been necessary. Without it, I might never have seen how little their approval mattered. My strength had never come from them. It had always come from within. One evening, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, the city lights glittering below like constellations, and I whispered the words I wished Clarissa could hear, though I no longer needed her to. They called me useless. but I built homes while they lost theirs. Justice isn't loud, it's permanent. That truth carried more weight than any insult ever could. In time, the scandal faded from the news cycle, but the story remained told again and again as inspiration. Women wrote to me sharing how they had stood up to their own Clarissas. Young students sent letters saying they wanted to build like I had built. Each message reminded me that the true payoff was not Clarissa's downfall, but the empowerment of others through my rise. And so, the chapter closed not with bitterness but with clarity. Clarissa had given me her scorn, and I had turned it into stone building something she could never tear down. My victory was not in her loss, but in the permanence of my purpose. CTA. If someone ever called you useless, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments.